When it comes to public safety in this nation, the answer is not defund the police, it's fund the police. Fund the police.
President Joe Biden spoke before a crowd in Pennsylvania, and the topic of discussion was the ongoing crime wave and also the fact that we are dealing with ever-growing issues surrounding gun violence in America. What he had to say about gun violence, I think, was, common sense. You know, he was talking about the need to ban certain assault rifles and how we need to protect children. It's the #1 cause of child deaths in this country, gun violence is. And so we're not gonna get into too many details about that portion of the speech, but I do think it's worth discussing the provocative statement you heard there at a time when the left is calling for the defunding of police departments across the country. You have a Democratic president who is saying in a very blunt way that no, we need to fund the police. And to be honest with you, what you're about to watch is my least favorite part of the speech that he gave. I think he made some good points, which we'll get to as well, but I think he went overboard in the pandering to the police that you're about to watch in this first clip. Let's watch.
I call it the Safer America's plan, and both your members of Congress voted for it. It's based on a simple notion. When it comes to public safety in this nation, the answer is not defund the police, it's fund the police. Fund the police. And give them, we expect them to do everything. We expect them to protect us, to be psychologists, and to be sociologists. I mean, we expect you to do everything. I'm not joking. Everything. You realize more police officers are killed dealing with domestic violence than anything else? You realize that? The point is, we ask so much of you.
And I have to admit, his energy throughout the speech was high, which is not something you could typically expect from Biden. Usually he's kind of stumbling on his words, there's low energy, but he was fired up throughout the entirety of the speech. And understand, he's not gonna go out there and say something that he knows will be politically unpopular. And that's the reason why I wanted to show that clip, because while it might seem jarring to the left, while it seems to go against the protests that took place in the summer of 2020, unfortunately, fact of the matter is most people in this country, including the majority of black voters, do not want to see police defunded. And so I wanted to explain the reason why Biden would say this, because based on left-wing media, you would assume, oh, this is actually gonna hurt him politically, but that's actually not the case. And so I wanted to share what happened with one of my favorite members of Congress, Representative Ilhan Omar, who surprisingly had a close primary race this time around after winning re-election very easily in 2020. And so what happened there? What happened with that congressional race? What worked against her? Was it money from her opponents that could have potentially crushed her? Why was that a close race? Well, let's discuss. Even though Representative Ilhan Omar had become a national lightning rod for attacks from the right and faced staunch opposition from pro-Israel groups that spent millions of dollars in hopes of defeating her, she won her 2020 race by more than 35,000 votes. But in 2022, Omar edged out only a narrow primary victory against a centrist Democrat, coming within 2,500 votes of losing her seat. So this is what I talk about, and this is what I'm referring to when I talk about the importance of paying close attention to where the country's climate is really at when it comes to the issue of policing, because I think we do end up making a mistake on the left where we exist in this echo chamber and we think that everyone's on board with something like defunding police. But then you look at what happened in this race and it looks like we might have a blind spot. And that's why I keep talking about these issues. It's not because I want to revert back to terrible tough on crime policies, but because I think it's important to listen to communities and what they're really concerned about. So now let's talk about a ballot initiative in Minneapolis where Ilhan Omar is of course a representative. That ballot initiative, known as Question 2, was something that Ilhan Omar was very supportive of, but the community was not supportive of. In fact, they voted against it pretty overwhelmingly, if you look specifically at the black community. But let's take a look at what the overall vote was on that ballot initiative that would have essentially defunded the police and would have instead funded a different type of policing, just reimagining the policing, and it wasn't persuasive enough for the people in Minneapolis. So for many in Minneapolis, the clashes over policing between Omar and her main Democratic rival in the primary, Dawn Samuels, were a continuation of last year's battle over the ballot measure to replace the Minneapolis Police Department with a new Department of Public Safety. Omar supported the measure, but moderate Democrats, including the mayor, Jacob Frey, called for improving the current department as an increase in homicides sparked concern. So just to give you one example, there was some reporting back in April of this year where people in Minneapolis were panicking. There were 6 homicides in 1 week. There were also some issues with the lack of police. A lot of people decided to retire, so they were short about 176 police officers. So when you're proposing a ballot initiative like this at a time when the community is experiencing a crime wave, there's already a shortage of cops and they're feeling the impact of that. They're not going to be as supportive as you would imagine in regard to this ballot initiative. So how badly did the initiative fail? Well, approximately 56% of voters rejected a ballot question that would have removed the Minneapolis Police Department from the city charter and replaced it with a public health-oriented Department of Public Safety. And the numbers are actually even more stark when you look at how the Black community voted on this, okay? So 78% of Black voters were not in favor of question 2. They did not want this. And I think it ended up hurting Ilhan Omar because unlike 2020 when she ran for re-election, this time around, she didn't have money pouring in from pro-Israel groups who wanted her out of office because she's critical of the Israeli government. They decided, we're not gonna bother with this race. We tried it in 2020, it didn't work out for us. She easily won re-election. So they actually stayed out of this race, believe it or not. Then I was under the impression that maybe, because this is always the case, well, maybe the vote no group, who obviously didn't want this initiative to pass, spent way more money, but that's actually not the case either. So let's take a quick look at graphic 5 here. These are the total expenditures for the Vote Yes campaign. So they spent more than $4.6 million on the campaign. The Vote No campaign, they didn't spend nearly as much. In fact, the Vote Yes campaign spent more than 3 times the amount of money. So let's look at the total expenditures for the Vote No campaign. And this is according to Ballotpedia. $1.4 million. So the money wasn't an issue. The pro-Israel groups funding Ilhan Omar's opponent wasn't an issue. The issue is that the majority of people who typically support her didn't like the fact that she was supportive of question 2 because they didn't want that. They did not want to replace the police officers with a reimagined version of public safety. And I think part of the problem as well, and this is based on interviews that I've watched, interviews that I've read with people in Minneapolis, they weren't persuaded that there was a detailed plan in place to replace the police. So they were actually concerned that their community would be less safe as a result of this ballot initiative passing. So you might disagree with that, but I do think that that shows a flaw in communication, at least a flaw in campaigning in the very least. But more importantly, I do think it's critical for the left, critical for those who want to reform policing, which I want desperately, to talk to the community and see what their concerns are. Talk to the community and see how they actually feel about the crime wave. Because I think we do make the mistake, and this is why I talk about this issue, guys. It's not because, again, I want to go to tough on crime policies. But I do think that the left, in the way that they message on these issues, comes across as if they don't care about the victims of violent crimes. And I do think it's important to make that distinction. When you see these instances of people getting raped, people getting killed, the homicide rate going up, people get scared. And if your response to that as a member of the left is to minimize it or brush it off, well, you're gonna lose credibility with that community. And that's the reason why I bring these issues up, okay? So I wanted to get to some other portions of Biden's speech in just a moment, but let's also just go to this one last graphic where the Washington Post reports that across town in North Minneapolis, the heart of the city's Black community, which has been hard hit by rising violence, voters said they strongly supported reform, but they were uneasy about what replacing the police department would mean, pointing to the lack of specifics about what would happen next. Again, this isn't a bad thing. This is an opportunity for us to learn. This is an opportunity for us to regroup and rethink what the strategy should be moving forward. Because it is important for people to feel safe. It is important for restorative justice to be implemented in a way where the community feels like they're part of the discussion and they're on board for what comes next. Now, with that said, let's go to the next Biden video. Because here he talks a little bit about, I disagree with what he says in this video. Let me just preface it by saying that. With that said, let's watch.
I've not met a cop who likes a bad cop. There's bad in everything. There's lousy senators, there's lousy presidents, there's lousy doctors, there's lousy lawyers. No, I'm serious. But I don't know any police officer that feels good about the fact that there may be a lousy cop. I'm tired of not giving the kind of help they need. Folks, look, we're in a situation in this country where we have to give them additional resources they need to get their job done.
So he calls for funding the police, they need additional resources. I highly recommend watching some of the interviews that Cedric Johnson has done on this very issue. He's been interviewed on Jacobin. I have seen some of his other talks online. And what I appreciate about him is he explains why it is that it actually makes more sense to offer more resources to reform policing, right? Because they do need to improve their training. They do need to have a far better vetting process to ensure that they're not hiring individuals who have a pretty significant bias that would lead to racist enforcement or racist actions once they're in the force. So what he said there, I actually disagree with, because he seems to be brushing over the fact that there are, yes, sure, you want to call them good cops, great. Except if any so-called good cop speaks out against excessive force or brutality or racism within their ranks, what happens to them? They get punished. And a lot of so-called good cops don't ever speak out. Maybe because they're afraid of being punished, or maybe because they would rather, not stir the pot, not get involved, and just want to go about their day. I just think if you see that kind of brutality being carried out by your fellow officers and you're not speaking out about it, and you're against changing and reforming the system that's brutalizing people, well, how can you then claim you're a good cop? That's the problem I have with the statement that Biden made there. I think policing is the first thing we should be focusing on when it comes to reform, because these are individuals who have lost trust within their communities. And that's not to say that these communities don't want policing. That's not to say they don't want to feel safe. They do want to feel safe. It's just that the way policing is carried out right now does not make them feel safe. I want to go to the final video here, okay? This is where Biden lists off important police reforms, and I agree with him here. But he talks about it on a federal level because that's really all he has executive control over. So let's take a look at what he says. Again, this is the last video, and then I'll discuss why we need to do this on a local level.
No federal officer is allowed to use a chokehold. No federal officer can there's restricted no-knock warrants. We created a national database for officers who have misbehaved and been held accountable so they can't hide. My plan will help make sure that state and local governments adopt these same reforms.
So those are reforms that we need for every local police department. And the only way that we can do that is to ensure that Congress passes legislation. And this is where I get incredibly frustrated with our Congress and their inability to get really important legislation through. We should end qualified immunity. We should create a situation in which a police officer has to think a little bit before they pull a trigger and shoot to kill an individual running away from them. They need to understand that, like with any other job, there are consequences for your actions. And especially for someone who deals with matters of life and death, those consequences, if they decide to brutalize or shoot and kill someone who's unarmed, those consequences should be pretty severe. But what we're experiencing now is just immunity. They get to carry out all of the acts of violence that we've seen over many years here at TYT. Just now we're starting to see some of the more extreme cases lead to prosecution. But qualified immunity is a huge problem. These chokeholds, they're banned in some local police departments, but not all of them. We need to streamline certain regulations, certain reforms, so every single local police department across the country has to abide by them. And we can have policing that actually does protect and serve communities. And more can be done on a local level for sure. But when it comes to basic reforms, the reforms that were listed there by Biden, I'd like to see those reforms passed through legislation on a federal level so it impacts every single local police department, regardless of what the political leanings are in those areas or those districts. But when it comes to the message of fund the police, it might rub you the wrong way, you might not like it, but it is important to understand why someone like Biden, close to the midterms, would feel bold enough to say it. And it's because he clearly has a better understanding of the communities who actually do not want to defund the police. They want to reform it. But the idea of defunding sounds like austerity to them. And so we need to do a better job with our messaging. We need to do a better job in taking seriously what these communities are concerned about. And we also need to be open-minded to different ideas. Not everyone believes in abolition. It doesn't mean that they're a rabid right-winger. So just some stuff that I've been thinking about. Hopefully no one's offended by it. And if you are, I guess I apologize.